it's really exciting to me. I know the PTFI is deeply, deeply scientific, but so much of what we'll learn from it will bring us joy and the deliciousness of food. So there's so much to learn today. I have to say that I have loved working with all of these folks. I've known and admired Rory Steiner for about 15 years, maybe a little more, and John and Selena have been so fun to work with. I'm really incredibly grateful that there are such incredible food system leaders working at the intersection of food, climate, and health, and it's amazing to have them with us today. And it's also an honor, as I said before, to be here at the New York Botanical Garden. I think Maurizio put it so well. This is a place that connects people and plants, and that's now, I think, needed more than ever before. So now we're going to have a very special keynote and a short conversation with Dan Saladino, a food journalist who has worked at the BBC for 25 years and the author of the book, Eating to Extinction, which I recommend you all pull out your phones and buy right now, hopefully from your local bookseller and not a big company that I shall not name. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Very excited to be here. I've got lots I want to cover, and I've just had a very big cup of coffee, so apologies if I start speaking very quickly. The title of the event that's brought us together, Food Diversity and the Power of Storytelling. The stories of food diversity that I think we'll be hearing over the next couple of days have dominated my career, in many ways my life. For the last 18 years. So I've worked for the BBC for 25 years, 10 years of which I was a general news journalist. And I started to work on a radio program, the food program, which was founded in 1979. I thought I would work on that radio program, which is effectively a documentary format, weekly show. I thought I would work on that for 1 year. It would look good on my CV, but I've ended up working on it for 18 years, and long may it continue. The stories I want to tell today come from the book that Danny has just mentioned, Eating to Extinction, the World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. And it is a celebration of food diversity. But it's a book project that took me on a journey, literally, globally. So I traveled around the world collecting food stories. And also, I wanted to understand why the stories I was increasingly attracted to, what did they have in common, and also some of the deeper meanings of them, both in terms of science, of culture, of communities. It all began in 2007 when I joined the program, and I came across this seemingly unpromising resource, which was an online catalogue created by a small team in northern Italy, Slow Food, and this was the Ark of Taste, the Noah's Ark of Taste, created by, as I mentioned, a small team who were concerned that a lot of the regional flavors, the varieties of vegetables, fruits, the breeds of animals were disappearing, and what was arriving instead was fast food. So Slow Food created a platform by which people around the world could tell the story of what was special, unique, important in their part of the world when it came to farming and food, and to say this is at risk of disappearing. So I turned that catalogue, or I selected some of the stories into a radio series, which you can still find on BBC Sounds. And I slowly came to become obsessed by this treasure trove of stories. So for a journalist, for a storyteller, 6,000 stories of endangered foods from 150 countries. And I must confess that I didn't fully appreciate their significance when I started to tell the stories, but they filled me with wonder. For example, the image on the left, wild citrus in the Garo Hills of northern India, where communities still interact with what most likely is the origins of all citrus around the world. And it's not just a celebration of biodiversity, it's also a celebration of a source of sustenance and fruit being used as medicine as well, because these wild citrus fruits are bitter and they're sour. And that is an important component of the people who live in this area of rich biodiversity. And for me, it meant that I could tell a story of how fruit breeders over 200 years bred out a lot of the bitterness and the sourness and gave us more and more sweet fruit. And what that means is that we removed a lot of the defense mechanism from the plants, and we ended up particularly in the 20th century, spraying fruit around the world with chemicals to substitute that. The second image is from the Bolivian Andes, and again, you can take one food, in this case, oca, a tuber, and it tells you the story of how humans dispersed around the world and ended up in high elevation places. How did they survive? This amazing story of human ingenuity and problem solving and the interaction between humans and plants to create something that then in turn spreads around the world. And we have tubers, including the potato, from this region. And food also tells us periods of history, important histories that we all should know. So these are cowpeas found in Sapelo Island, part of the chain of sea islands in the south. And it's the story of over centuries. How did a cowpea from West Africa end up in the American South? And that takes you into the stories, again, of the amazing agricultural systems that existed in the African continent that then arrive in the Americas with enslaved people. Not just the genetic resources of the cowpeas, but also the farming knowledge, the skills. So this became a book that has now traveled around the world. But in the process of writing the book, I had to answer some very basic questions. And I think as a non-expert, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a farmer, I'm not a chef, I'm not a scientist of plant botany, but I needed to explain to myself and to my readers, why does food diversity exist in the first place? Is it endangered? And if so, why? And possibly the most important question of all, why should we care? Food diversity and its origins, I believe, is one of the most important stories we can tell. Since in the 17th and 18th century, in the period of the Enlightenment, scientists were already trying to figure out where did these crops come from. How is it that we ended up with the food we have today? So from Alphonse de Candolle right through to researchers today, and I've mentioned here on the slide Dorian Fuller at UCL in London, who is an archaeobotanist. What's so important about this is that we still are left with many mysteries of how humans began to interact with wild plants and wild animals and provide us with the resources that we have today, including, most famously, the Fertile Crescent, where you end up with the Neolithic package of wheat, barley, chickpeas, lentils, vetches, and also the domestication of sheep, cattle, and goats, and the dispersal of those plants and animals, and the way they adapt to different environments and different cultures, different cultural preferences, create huge diversity. This happens around 12,000 years ago as we're seeing a big period of climate change. And it's also the case in China with rice domestication as well. Over vast spaces and long periods of time, humans interacting with wild plants and subconsciously and consciously creating the crops and the diversity that humans had for many thousands of years. And I think the most mind-blowing story of all in the highlands of Mexico, how we went from having this very unpromising, weedy plant that could break your teeth if you were to bite into it, to these very generous, energy-rich cobs of corn. Again, a story in which humans begin interacting with wild plants and over a huge geographical area and thousands of years, a process in which the earliest farmers to interact with these wild plants had no idea what the direction of travel would be with this plant, but it took us to here. And it's a mystery to me why this story of human ingenuity, of problem solving, of creation of these amazing foods is not told it is not taught in schools. It should be a compulsory subject. As a journalist, we like to have some controversy, some disagreement in the narrative, and also some element of tragedy in some way. And it's represented in the career of the Russian botanist Nikolai Vavilov, who famously in the 1920s traveled across 5 continents to collect the seeds of many, many different crops. And Vavilov, in the 1920s, was convinced that the genetic diversity of food would be important for the future of humanity. Unfortunately, he fell out of favor with Stalin and Marxist science and ended up dying of the very thing he was trying to prevent, which was hunger. Diversity was also something in the toolkit of Norman Borlaug, who in the 1950s and 60s took varieties of wheat from the Americas and this amazing process of crossing with types of wheat that had been found in Japan to create the dwarfed wheats that made the Green Revolution possible. But the fascinating thing for me arriving into this story are these questions over which direction do we take the food system. This was a turning point, and in the late 50s and early 1960s, Europe already had some incredibly important observers of this process that was unfolding, including Rachel Carson, who was obviously commenting in Silent Spring about the impact of the new agricultural system and the consequences for planet and for nature. But also, I think really on the ball when it came to the loss of diversity across landscapes. This loss of diversity that was unfolding in the midpoint of the 20th century was also picked up by Jack Harlan, another influential American botanist, who in a 1972 paper said that these resources, meaning crop diversity, stand between us and catastrophic starvation on a scale we cannot imagine. And those words were in turn read by another generation of American botanists, including Carrie Fowler, who lobbied the Norwegian government, believing that we needed to protect the resources that had been created over thousands of years of farming, and persuaded them to dig a tunnel deep into the Arctic and create the Svalbard seed vault. We already heard about the fact that there are tens of thousands of plants that humans have interacted with for food. How much diversity is out there, we don't know, but Svalbard gives us a clue in terms of the accessions, the samples taken from around the world, and you can see some of the figures there. And an important location, because what it holds is the legacy of thousands of years of farming by my ancestors and all of your ancestors as well. But is food diversity endangered? And again, there are experts in the room who will be talking about some of their research and the data on that. But as a journalist, as a storyteller, I wanted to get beyond the figures, the data that's presented, that often mean something in terms of, I guess, striking ideas of the transitions that the food system has been on. So the FAO, for example, talking about the dependence on 9 major crops, 3 of which, wheat, maize and rice, provide more than 50% of the world's calories. But this data wasn't enough in terms of storytelling. So what I wanted to do was actually go out to find some of these endangered foods, meet the farmers, talk to the communities, and to get some of the history of how this food came into existence, why it was important, and why was it disappearing. And in eastern Anatolia, close to the Fertile Crescent, where there is a type of wheat, emmer wheat, that farmers have maintained, and it's now a very, very endangered type of wheat. It wasn't just about the crop. It was about the skills of how to mill that wheat. It was also about the communities, their local economy, that they could sell this rare wheat to chefs in Istanbul and actually get more of an income for their farms. But it was also the emotional connection people had with these foods. So people were telling me that kavalja, which is the type of wheat, they believed it to be part of their inheritance. It had distinctive flavor, and how many of us can say that we've had that experience when it comes to wheat? It was also something that they believed when they were eating it was like a medicine to them, but disappearing. There's a story I tell in Eating to Extinction from Oaxaca, a place in which there were scientists arriving in the late 1970s trying to understand about maize diversity and finding very surprising plants and producing a lot of maize in unpromising soil. But more striking was the fact that these maize plants were 16 feet tall and had strange aerial roots which were dripping mucus. And this puzzled scientists until around 6-7 years ago, when people or a team of scientists at UC Davis analyzed the mucus and discovered that it actually is full of microbes being fed sugars by the plant, and in turn the microbes are fixing nitrogen from the air. Something that we're familiar with in terms of leguminous plants, so peas and beans, highly unusual in cereal crops. And this was one of the few villages that had maintained this unusual, strange-looking plant that meant that, certainly in terms of artificial inputs and fertilizer, this was a completely new way of looking at how crops could grow, but obviously really important in terms of their local culture and their identity as well. So you start to begin to understand that there are things that we are losing that we don't even really fully understand. And the why should we care part of the third question I was asking myself. This took me to a place on the outskirts of Cambridge where there are crop breeders who are. This was an institute founded in just after the First World War in 1919, and this is a team that is responsible for crop breeding and producing some of the future wheats that will be grown in many parts of Europe. And what they were telling me is that because of the lack of diversity that the modern Green Revolution wheats, particularly of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, had taken us on a path in terms of food production of monocultures, they were working to take wheat back through its evolutionary history. So they were taking the kavalja wheat, the Emma wheat that I'd seen in Turkey, and using some of the traits to bring that back into wheat because so much had been lost. That really matters because we are faced with an unpredictable future where there are crop diseases impacting on farmers and on yields, and we need more resilience in the food system, and this is what diversity brings. The most famous story, obviously, is of the Cavendish banana, but that's almost like the star story of lack of diversity, of monocultures and genetic uniformity and cloning. But take any crop around the world, and you can see there are threats and challenges, and diversity is part of the solution. There's also a wave of new science. Don't worry too much about the trying to read any of the detail, but these are a couple of papers from recent years that are talking about the soil microbiome. And this is what we are now discovering about some of the particularly pre-Green Revolution wheats and the way that their root systems interact with the soil microbiome, which has consequences for, certainly in terms of the disease resistance of some of the wheats, nutrient profiling of the wheats as well. And so this is new science that we are now able to use to understand why that diversity mattered. It's also important in terms of some of the I guess, things that are part of our everyday lives. So coffee, for example, is drawn from a very narrow genetic base of Arabica robusta. It turns out there are more than 120 different species of coffee, one of which went extinct in the 1950s in Sierra Leone, called Highland coffee, scientific name Cafeus stenophila. This matters because Arabica is becoming vulnerable to climate change, and the modeling, the forecasting in future decades shows that it will become more susceptible to disease and less productive. So scientists from Kew, with scientists from Sierra Leone, tracked down some of the last remaining plants of stenophila and have brought it back, and there are people who have now tasted this coffee again, and it's more resilient to climate change and unpredictable rainfall as well. So this is another example of lost diversity that needs to be part of our future. But it also brings a wider opportunity as well. Going back to the Neolithic package, I mentioned the lentil, which dispersed, traveled around the world, adapted to local environments, including in this rocky part of southern Germany, where a farmer, Walter Mammel, was mourning the loss, the extinction of a local lentil that had been an important part of their food culture, their identity, and an agricultural system, part of a system of rotation where the lentil would be used to fertilize the soil. And he contacted seed banks around the world, couldn't find anyone who'd collected the specific lentil, traveled with some farmer friends all the way to Russia to go to the seed bank that Vavilov, who I'd mentioned earlier, had created, or actually had expanded in the 1930s. And this is a joyful image for me of a reunion between somebody who has been handed a pack of seeds to take back to Germany to grow. And this also tells you the powerful story of human, the human experience, that do we really want to live in a world in which we're wearing the same clothes, listening to the same music, watching the same films, farming in the same way, eating the same foods? And I think this is one of the motivations of this farmer, was to be reunited with the distinctive food culture and the farming practices of his region. But it became a business, and there are now more than 100 farmers growing this lentil. He inspired farmers in other parts of Europe, including Sweden, to go back through their culinary history, look at the peas and beans that they grew and they ate. And in the UK, we now have a business called Hodmedods that is bringing back peas and beans that were grown during the Iron Age in Britain. And it matters as a story because we are thinking about not just crop diversity, but dietary diversity. And as we think about what do we do about protein in the future, well, we mostly cracked it in the last few thousand years by growing peas, beans, and lentils, fertilizing the soil and providing nutritious, delicious food. This is another story of diversity as an opportunity. For people unfamiliar with the dance music scene in Britain in the 1990s, this is a guy called Andy Cato, who was in a band called Groove Armada, did very well, so he moved to France, became a farmer, grew vegetables, but realized that he had very poor soil, became obsessed with how do I repair this soil and how do I produce wheat that is good for the soil. He sold his music rights, his pension as a musician, and invested it in a business called Wild Farmed, which is now a network of farmers, around 100 farmers, who are being given a way out of the commodity crop model. And they're bringing in wheat and beans. There are cover crops, livestock. It's a story of diversity. And you might be thinking, well, that's nice, quaint. He might be selling some of this flour to artisan bakers. It's arriving on the high street. And this is what one of Britain's most famous foods, sliced white bread. And then this more diverse wheat is on the high street with one of our big retailers, Marks and Spencer. So change is happening, innovation is happening. There's a recognition of the importance of diversity and a story being told to people buying food in these stores. And just thinking about a global level, clearly, can you imagine the potential of these models if we start to address some of the big structural issues, agricultural subsidies, for example. And that is starting to happen. So in COP15, we had the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was signed by more than 100 countries. And in the Global Biodiversity Framework, there is the commitment to prevent further extinction of species. And you might be thinking these are exotic birds and plants in the Amazon, etc. This now recognizes the value of crop diversity and food diversity that humans created over thousands of years and that we are at risk of losing. So I'm feeling optimistic at least about the conversations that are happening at a global level. Let's wait to see what the action is. Just to finish off, I think the thing that makes me most optimistic is a reason that revolves around our self-interest. The emerging science, and to know now that we have the Periodic Table of Food Initiative contributing to this, we have for much longer than a century in a way, a reductionist approach to the science, agricultural and nutritionally. And I think the new era of science is revealing to us complexity and the importance of diversity. We are already getting glimpses in terms of mainstream narratives around our health and our relationship with food, with the stories of gut microbiome, and the fact that there is the impact of the diversity of our gut microbiomes on our physical and mental health, and that the more diverse our diets, we know that it helps to have creates a more diverse gut microbiome. We are in the early stages, and I think in the coming years, in fact in the coming decades, this will become so familiar to us. The science will reach the mainstream. There will be demand, not only from people buying food, but actually governments who are starting to see the science and the data and its relevance to reducing public health budgets. But also, food diversity is part of our evolutionary history. So when archaeologists have been able to excavate bog bodies that have been preserved and intact, a rare glimpse into the diets of our ancestors, Tollen man is one of the best preserved and was excavated in the 1950s. It's 2,500 years old, and inside his stomach were the seeds of 40 different plants. And in a sense, I think for many important reasons, we were taken on a path in which we lost diversity. We are now living in an era in which we can reclaim that diversity, and it will be underpinned by science. And thankfully, the reason why we still have diversity to draw from, the reason why those farmers in Oaxaca saved the maize, the reason why the farmers were still growing Kavaljar wheat in Turkey is because of the importance of those communities and the strength of their food identities and their culture. So I am an optimist. Thank you.
That was amazing. That was amazing. Dan, you deserve all of that applause. Dan started off talking about how he was obsessed with this issue, and thank goodness he is, because we need more storytellers like Dan to raise awareness. So in this final sort of 30 seconds that we have left, Dan, I wonder what you've said you're so much of an optimist that we should all care, but what is your advice to eaters and scientists and other folks who are, learning about the PTFI? What do you want them to know about the PTFI? And why are you an optimist?
I could give you a list of lots of practical things, and they are important, in terms of the power we now have, in our pockets with our phones to interact with farmers, with food producers. What has motivated me for 25 years is to tell the story. And that, I think, is the missing ingredient in a way, because this, hopefully, some of those stories you found inspirational. Some of the history is fascinating, and it's important because it's our story, but they're not being told. And that's
Yeah.
I feel that's my responsibility. And I think if more people were empowered with these stories, they could engage more, and they can actually be part of change.
That's the perfect answer. Thank you so much. Give it up for Dan
Great.
Saladino.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you so much. So great, so great.